Hello class. What I'm going to do here for the blood is I'm going to create a series of 5 videos for you. So I'm going to cover the blood component in screen capture videos instead of covering it in class. You should watch all 5 of these screen capture videos by the due date that I assign in class. But you can watch them as many times as you like. Okay, so this first video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by introducing the blood to you. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the important components of the blood, some blood generalities, and then I'll talk a little bit about the plasma components of the blood. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we think about the blood, what comes to mind, right? This kind of red substance that every time we cut ourselves kind of oozes out of our skin. But the blood really provides an important, many important functions for the human organism. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of those. So the first one is transport. Probably the most important function of the blood is transport. And the blood's going to transport over 100 different substances throughout the body. Okay, substances that are vital for our health, things like oxygen, nutrients, so things like glucose and amino acids, so that we can build muscle tissue, or cells can function well with the use of those amino acids to build proteins. So we can deliver hormones. We just finished talking about the endocrine system. So the blood's going to be important in delivering substances to cells. That's how the cells all over your body are able to receive nutrients and vital chemicals for their health. Secondly, what does the blood do for us? Well, the blood is a regulator. So a regulator of what? Well, the blood can actually regulate our body temperature. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, if we get too warm, it's actually the blood that helps get rid of that excess body heat. Okay, so the blood can actually carry that excess heat to the surface of the skin and allow that excess heat to dissipate through the skin tissues and eventually be released into the atmosphere. The blood also helps regulate the pH of our body fluids. Okay, so it's important to note that the pH of the blood is about 7.35 to 7.45. Okay, and if you remember from Bio 103, this reference range is very important. If we fall too far below 7.35 or too high above 7.45, that can spell disaster for our internal homeostasis. So the blood has chemicals in it and proteins in it and other molecules that allow it to keep that pH stable. Okay. Finally, one thing that the blood does for us is it protects us. Okay, so how does the blood protect us? Well, it can do so with a series of cells, and I'm sure you've heard of these cells before. They're called white blood cells, and they help us fight infection. Okay, so there are infection fighters, and we'll spend some time talking about these cells. How else does the blood protect us? Well, the blood can also protect us because we are able to form clots. All right, so there are specific components that are part of the blood that allow us to stop the flow of blood if in fact we do damage some vessels or some tissue. All right, so let's move ahead and let's talk about how the blood moves around the body. So it's best to start out from the kind of central point where blood begins its movement, and that is I think we all know that blood starts from the heart. Okay, so when blood leaves the heart, it's going to enter vessels called arteries. Okay, and we'll spend some time talking about arteries, quite a bit of time when we talk about the heart specifically and blood vessels. But what I want to draw your attention to is this asterisk here, and that is the left side of the heart. And the left side of the heart is going to be the side of the heart in which blood is going to move out, all right, into arteries, and those arteries are going to deliver blood to working tissues, and those arteries are going to get progressively smaller and smaller. Okay, and in that in those vessels, the oxygen component of the blood is extremely high, and so is the nutrient content. Okay, so we're delivering oxygen and we're delivering nutrients to tissues. So those tissues can use that oxygen for energy and those nutrients to make the energy. Okay. Once we get down to kind of the smallest vascular level, we're going to nourish those tissues. Okay. So there's going to be an exchange that's going to take place here at the kind of capillary level. So you can see that all of those arteries are branching, and they are going to meet up with our venous circulation. Okay, so it's at this level where exchange is going to take place, and blood is then going to be delivered to a series of veins. So we're going to be entering the venous side of the circulation, and that blood is going to return to the heart. Okay, that blood is going to be oxygen depleted. Okay, so we've delivered oxygen to the tissues at the capillary level, and it's going to be carbon dioxide rich. So we're going to be picking up carbon dioxide from those working tissues and bringing that carbon dioxide back to the heart, and that blood is eventually going to go to the lungs to get rid of the carbon dioxide and to pick up more oxygen. So here I'm drawing some arrows back to the heart, okay, and then we'll eventually end up on the right side of the heart, where once we leave the right side of the heart, we are going to go to the lungs. Okay, so we can see we're going to the lungs here. All right, so that's how blood circulates. Leaves the left side of the heart, goes into arteries. Those arteries get progressively smaller. The blood in the arteries is oxygen and nutrient rich. We're delivering the oxygen and nutrients to tissues at the capillary level. That's where the exchange occurs, and then eventually those capillaries become the venous side of the circulation, and those veins start out small. They get progressively larger and larger, and eventually they go back to the right side of the heart. From the right side of the heart, we are going to go to the lungs. So vessels, large vessels, are going to carry blood to the lungs, at which those vessels will get progressively smaller, and we'll get gas exchange occurring in the lungs. All right, so let's move forward here, and let's just take a look at overall blood composition. So what is the blood made of? So first of all, we can take a look at, by weight, how much the blood is responsible for our percentage of body weight, and that is 8%. So 8% of who you are is blood, and that's pretty significant. And whole blood is made of a couple of different components. All right, the first one is plasma, and plasma is going to be the liquid component of our blood, and formed elements. Okay, so formed elements are going to be our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and cell fragments called platelets. And each of those formed elements has a particular function to do, and we'll talk about those formed elements in some detail. How much blood is flowing through our vessels? Well, in the average adult, there's about 5 to 6 liters of blood. Okay, now depending on your weight and your height and your gender, that may vary a little bit. But how much is 5 to 6 liters of blood? Well, I think most of you are familiar with gallons, so that is about 1.5 gallons. Okay, so we have about 1.5 gallons of blood flowing through our vessels, right? All right, so if we take some whole blood and we want to look at it, we want to separate the plasma component from the formed element component, we can do that. And we can do that by spinning the blood in a centrifuge. And when we do that, what happens is all of the formed elements, the heavier materials, will settle to the bottom. Okay, and the plasma, or the liquid component, that fluid will settle on top. Okay, and then we can draw from either of those two compartments, and we can take a look at the component of the plasma or the component of the formed element. So let's quickly take a look at plasma here, and then we'll look at formed elements, and then we'll look at some of these components in some greater detail. So the plasma is mostly water, okay? And this goes back to that first slide when we talked about how the blood is able to regulate our body temperature, and that's because it's mostly water, so we're able to absorb heat or get rid of heat very easily by using the basic properties of water in the plasma. In addition to water, okay, which makes up most of the plasma, there are also dissolved solutes. Okay, so remember, a solute in a solution is this kind of solid component that's dissolved in the liquid. Okay, and we've got many different dissolved solutes, and as I mentioned, there are over 100. Okay, in the blood, and these solutes are being carried by the plasma. All right, which is essentially by the water. Okay, and if we take a look here at the plasma, the largest component of solute by weight are actually proteins. Some very important proteins that we are going to use in our circulatory system are actually found in the plasma. Okay, so you can see there are 3 very important proteins here. All right, we'll talk about those in a little bit of detail. And 2% of that plasma is going to be other dissolved solutes. Okay, so here are a couple of examples. So some ions, right? Things like maybe like potassium ion or calcium being carried by the blood, chloride ion, okay, sodium, right? Nutrients, things like glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, delivering nutrients to cells so they can use those cells to make energy. Waste products, so we need to get rid of metabolic waste that cells are producing. They have a tendency to cause the fluids of the body to become acidic, so we need to get rid of those, and we can deliver those waste products to the kidney, and the kidney can filter those out, but we're going to be delivering them to the kidney with the plasma. All right, gases, blood gases, so oxygen and carbon dioxide carried in the plasma. Some of it can be. Okay, regulatory substances. All right, so things like drugs. If you were to take a pharmaceutical, some aspirin, ibuprofen, you were to take any type of medication, it's always going to be delivered to the cells that need it through the blood. Okay, and it's going to be dissolved in the plasma. Things like hormones, all right, delivered to cells with the plasma. What is the formed element component of the blood? So there are 3 pieces to the formed element component, and I mentioned these 3 up top, and that is red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. And each of these formed elements has their own specific name. So we call red cells erythrocytes, we call white cells leukocytes, and we call platelets thrombocytes. So you should be familiar with these terms. You should be able to use them interchangeably. So very basically, and we're going to spend some time talking about these formed elements, but essentially what red cells are going to do for us is they're going to carry oxygen, okay, and deliver that oxygen to tissues. White cells are going to help us fight infection. And our thrombocytes, or platelets, they are going to help us clot the blood or stop the flow of blood. Okay, so let's move forward and let's talk about the plasma component of the blood. So we're going to spend a little time talking about the plasma component, and then that will be the end of this first video. All right, so what I want to do now is I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the blood plasma. So it's one of the major components of the blood. It's actually the largest component of the blood, and I mentioned on the initial slide one of the functions of the blood was transport. Okay, and that is transporting substances around to tissues, and it's actually the plasma that's going to accomplish this function for us. So the plasma, being largely water, allows different solutes to be dissolved in it, and to successfully deliver those solutes to their desired location. What I want to spend a little bit of time talking about is plasma proteins. Okay, and the plasma proteins in part help to maintain blood pressure. Okay, so what I'm going to draw here is a vessel. So this is a blood vessel. We know that we have blood that flows through our blood vessels, right? And that blood is largely water, and that fluid is going to exert a pressure on the walls of the vessels. Okay, and this pressure is important because we need to maintain that pressure in order to keep blood flowing in a forward direction. If you didn't have pressure, for example, in a garden hose, if there was no water pressure in the hose, water would not move through the hose. Okay, and the same holds true for your blood vessels. So one of the major things that plasma does is it helps maintain blood pressure. Okay, so how does it do that? Well, let's go ahead and let's take a look again quickly here at how blood flows from the heart to working tissues. All right, on the left-hand side of this image, let's assume that blood is coming from the heart and flowing through arteries. All right, and those arteries are going to branch into smaller vessels, and those vessels are going to carry oxygen and nutrients into capillaries, and at the capillary level, this is where exchange is going to take place. After exchange of those gases and nutrients and chemicals, blood is going to be drained into a series of smaller venous structures, all right, and eventually that blood is going to drain into progressively larger and larger veins, and that blood is going to be heading back to the heart for us. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about the three different types of plasma proteins that we find in the plasma. All right, and the first plasma protein is called albumin. All right, and albumin makes up a significant part of the plasma protein content. 60%. It's the largest plasma protein, by number in the plasma. Albumin is made in the liver, and albumin has a couple of important functions. Okay, one of them is albumin can be used as a protein to help transport water-insoluble substances. Okay, so anything that is lipid-based, for example, or a molecule that is neutral and doesn't like to interact with polar water molecules, we can coat them in albumin, and we can use albumin to transport those substances around in the body. Albumin can also be used as a buffer. So proteins can be used to help buffer the blood. Remember, a buffer is a chemical that can bind to or release hydrogen ions into solution to keep the pH of the solution stable. And we know that the pH of blood is between 7.35 and 7.45. We like to keep it there for optimal body health. Finally, what albumin is going to do is it is going to maintain something called osmotic pressure in a vessel. Okay, so what does that mean exactly? So what I want to do is I want to take you back to Bio 103 and remind you the way that fluid works and the way that fluid will move if we separate fluid from an area where we have a high solute concentration from an area where we have a low solute concentration. Okay, so in this picture here, we have a container that is separated by a semi-permeable membrane. Okay, and your blood cells are semi-permeable membranes, including your blood vessels. All right, so your blood vessels are made of cells, and those cells have semi-permeable membranes. So if we go ahead and take a look at this container, on the right-hand side of the container is low solute concentration, and on the on the right-hand side of the container is low solute concentration, and on the left side of the container is a high solute concentration. Remember that water is always drawn by osmosis to an area of high solute concentration. Okay, so water always wants to go where there's more solute. Okay, so what does that mean for albumin and for our blood pressure? Well, we want water to stay in our blood vessels. If water doesn't stay in our blood vessels, then we can't keep proper pressure inside those vessels, and blood will not move. So let's go ahead and take a look at how albumin helps to keep fluid inside our vessels. Okay, get rid of those lines. All right, so here we have a picture of a capillary. So this is a capillary, and remember, a capillary is our smallest blood vessels, and we can see here that these capillaries are made of cells, right? So you can see the little nucleus of the cells that make up the wall of the capillary. All right, and blood flows through a capillary, and our blood will be flowing from a left to a right direction. All right, And the reason why water likes to stay in our blood vessels is because we have a lot of plasma proteins in there, okay? And most of those are albumin. So it keeps the blood really concentrated with solutes, and as a result, water stays inside the blood, all right? Well, what would happen if we were sending blood through a capillary, but inside the capillary we had significantly lower amounts of albumin than we otherwise normally should have. So these little brown dots here indicate these protein molecules called albumin. Well, at the capillary level, when we're delivering blood to tissues, or we're delivering nutrients and blood gases to tissues, the fluid pressure that's inside the vessel, right? Remember I told you that fluid inside that vessel pushes on the walls of the vessel. The fluid pressure is actually high enough that it forces some fluid, some plasma, out into the tissue space. Now this is normal. This happens in a normal healthy capillary as well. So I'll draw those arrows in an outward direction. Okay, and fluid collects normally in our tissues. Okay. However, in normal capillaries, we have lots of albumin inside the capillary. So as soon as fluid is pushed out, we pull that fluid right back in, okay? Because that fluid, that liquid, is attracted to an area where there is a high solute concentration. And that high solute concentration is provided by the high levels of albumin in the blood. Well, what if our levels of albumin were low? So we would have in here, we'd have a low solute concentration. So these brackets mean concentration. Okay, so if we had low amounts of solutes in the blood, we didn't have enough albumin, the pull for water to come back into those vessels would be significantly decreased. And over time, our blood pressure would progressively drop. Okay, so it's important that we have proper amounts of albumin because they maintain osmotic pressure. And what osmotic pressure is the pulling pressure. So this green arrow is our osmotic pressure. It is the draw for water back into the capillary after some fluid has leaked out. So very, very important, okay? Globulins. So globulins make up the next largest component of the plasma proteins of the blood. And they're going to come from a couple of different locations. Okay, albumin came from the liver, so that's important. The globulins are going to come from white blood cells in the form of antibodies. Right, so those antibodies that are fighting infection for us are produced from white blood cells. We're also going to produce some globulins from the liver as well. Okay. Finally, fibrinogen, the component of plasma proteins that is the least, okay, also comes from the liver, just like globulins and albumin did. But remember, globulins also can come from white blood cells. But what fibrinogen does for us, and we're going to talk about this later on in the lecture, is it allows us to properly clot our blood. All right, if we take a look at an image of some blood that has clotted, if we look at it on a microscopic level, we can see that there is this mesh network of proteins that's set up that actually works as kind of a trapping mechanism for blood cells leaking out of a torn vessel. Okay, and this mesh network is actually a derivative of fibrinogen. Okay, so this will end our discussion of generalities of the blood and the plasma component of the blood, and we'll pick up with the next lecture soon.